Hi, Father Joe.
Howdy.
We're just about to get started. Okay. Father Joe, if you haven't muted yourself yet, would you start us with a prayer, please?
Absolutely. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen.
Amen.
Christ, our true God, we ask you to fill our time together with your presence, to enlighten our hearts and our minds to the love you have for us, and how we can shine forth that love in stewardship to you and to your holy church. For you are holy to the ages of ages. Amen.
Amen.
All right, well, let me quickly just set the table here. Everybody can go ahead and mute themselves for now, just so we keep the background noise to a minimum. Joining us so far, I have Helen Rankin, Michelle Katsagrelis, John Bober, Ted Chirpus, Father Andrew Tikikis, and Father Joe DiStefano, all on the line, and obviously our guest speaker, Stephen Christoforou, who, thank you, Stephen, for giving us some of your time this afternoon. As I mentioned to you before, there are a lot of people who are anxious to watch the video of this because I think there are a lot of people anxious to understand how they can offer an appeal to young adults, emerging adults, to help them understand the importance of all of their stewardship, time, talent, and treasure in their parishes.
Yeah.
And I've explained to you briefly, this is the Pittsburgh Metropolis Stewardship Team. So everybody on this call works in their parish in some capacity or another on stewardship for the most part. Stephen's got, maybe 15 or 20 minutes worth of presentation, and then I hope we get a good discussion going afterwards. If you'd like to send me questions via chat, I'm happy to do that way, or raise your hand after you want, and I'll after Stephen's done presenting, and I'll happily call on you. Stephen, I'm going to turn it over to you with that, and thank you again.
Great. Thank God. It's good to be here. Thanks for having me. I feel like this is it's an important question, which isn't simply something about stewardship, right? But I feel like the disconnect that we sometimes see with young people when it comes to them being stewards in the church, like you said before, offering their time, talent, and treasure, that I think points to a deeper disconnect in the lives of young people. And so hopefully what we'll do is, like you said, I will be brief. I'll have kind of like 10, 15 minutes tops, and then we can open it up for discussion and questions. I kind of want to offer four elements, four factors that we can consider in terms of cultivating this sort of stewardship spirit amongst young people, which we're going to touch on kind of wider questions, I think, of ministry and alienation and discontent and disconnection and things along those lines. And I think, what we should start with is sort of the lay of the land. Because it's hard to be prescriptive, right? It's hard to offer solutions or best practices or anything going forward if we don't first have an understanding of some of the struggles and the issues that are out there. And I want to offer three kind of categories or sort of markers of issues, just kind of cultural problems, struggles, also opportunities that exist in the wider community. I think they actually affect people who of all ages, not simply youth and young adults, although probably it's more the effect of some of these factors is much more concentrated maybe on young adults. So I want to start by opening with these three, just kind of raising them to your attention as a little bit of background, and then we'll get into the four elements, four questions that I'll raise later on. So the first one, right, which I think is very obvious for all of us, is doubt. Doubt is something that is just sort of in the air that we breathe. Doubt is something that folks of all generations, folks of all ages seem to struggle with. Is God real? Is he there? Does he care about me? Is the church what we say it is? Those just sort of basic questions about who God is, what the church is. And of course, if we are plagued with these sort of doubts, which are increasingly common, if not natural, right, just based on sort of where we are in history, and we can get into that later if you really want. If a person is beset by doubts, they're probably that much more unlikely to give, right? Like, why would you give to a God that you don't think is there? Why would you give to a church that isn't quite what it says it is? So doubt is one of these factors that I think is both a personal sort of struggle in our faith journey, and it has these consequences when it comes to stewardship and ministry and things along those lines. So doubt as this first factor that we're dealing with. Second, loneliness. Loneliness is also just becoming epidemic in our society, right? I think a couple of years ago, the health insurer Cigna released this study, which, I mean, the results were ridiculous. The amount of people who feel isolated, disconnected, have nobody to talk to, right? Have nobody to turn to, which is interesting because we've sort of seen some of these loneliness numbers jump even as we've seen social media and other kinds of connectivity means arise, which I think is kind of interesting and potentially bears some unpacking. But loneliness, right, is also a factor that affects us as Christians. The church on some level is a community. And if people are lonely, if people are disconnected from that community, that's also going to compromise their sort of self-understanding as Christians and their desire to give. You know, I'm not going to give to my brothers and sisters in Christ if I feel cut off from them and I don't quite feel that they are brethren in any sort of real sense. So that existential sense of loneliness is another factor that we have to deal with. The third that I would suggest too is uncertainty. And I think uncertainty is increasingly becoming something that young people struggle with, but it's also sort of focused in the church as well. And I'll share a story which is interesting. I was speaking to a young man recently, and he graduated college. He is sort of feeling this potential pull, this potential call to go to seminary one day. And he just wanted to talk it out and figure out, from my experience, like, how do you discern the call and how do you respond and so forth. And as we had this conversation, it became very clear that there's just sort of this cliff of uncertainty that young people seem to go through or sort of fall off after we graduate college. Right? Think about it. When you're in grade school, you kind of have very clear rudders and markers and lines that sort of guide your life, right? And then you get to junior high and you know what you need to do, and you get to high school and you know what you need to do, right? You need to get to a good college, and you go to a good college, and maybe the opportunity is grad school, right? That's the goal. But for those who don't, right, or those who eventually graduate grad school, you sort of have to build a life. And the training wheels come off, and this sort of natural progression from one to the other that characterizes so much of our lives as young people, suddenly that's gone. And that's why so many people are left feeling rootless and rudderless and not really sure what to do with themselves. Like, they've been following this path and suddenly the path is gone and they don't know what to do. And on some level, that also affects us as Christians, right? Like, there's a reason why people tend to fall away from the church after the youth ministry stuff is done, right? Like, there are people who can go religiously, so to speak. They go to the athletic programs, they go to the dance programs, they go to Sunday school, they go to youth group, and suddenly they graduate high school and all that stuff is gone, and they fall off the face of the planet because they have no sort of inner compass or inner sense about what to do with themselves as Christians. They spent all their years being Sunday school students. Suddenly there's no Sunday school anymore. And what's a Sunday school student without Sunday school? Don't know what to do with themselves, right? And so there's young people who just struggle to pray and struggle to fast and struggle to do the basic things that characterize ourselves as Christians because they just sort of don't know what next step to take. There's all these paths that are in front of them, and they simply don't know what to do, which is kind of a big cultural problem and also affects us as Christians. So doubt, loneliness, and uncertainty, I think, are really these markers of young life today. And I think it's with that sort of in the background that I want to offer some of these questions going forward, right? But that's kind of the lay of the land in a big picture question. When it also comes to stewardship, I think we have to have a little bit of a gut check moment as the adults in the conversation. And it's kind of a simple question, but I think it's a powerful one, right? Stewardship is ultimately about offering. Stewardship is ultimately about offering something valuable, right? Time, talent, treasure, the trinity that we normally talk about with stewardship. I think it's kind of a question to us as adults. Do we actually believe that young people have anything to offer, anything valuable to offer? Because I wonder sometimes if implicit in the way that we do youth ministry, for instance, implicit in the way that we relate to young people as adults, it's kind of that, that old cultural mantra, children are meant to be seen and not heard. I think we kind of see young people as recipients of the valuable things that we have to give them. But I wonder, right, and this is kind of a personal sort of gut check moment, do we actually think young people have anything valuable to offer? And if the answer to that is no, then the whole concept of stewardship of young people is sort of moot, right? Because they have nothing to give. If the question is yes, then we can dig into this a little bit deeper and wonder what is preventing young people from offering these valuable things that they have in their lives. So with all that said, right, the lay of the landscape, the cultural stuff, what it's like to be a young person today, maybe our unconscious bias about the value that young people bring to the table, that's all the background, and I want to go into 4 elements, and I'll phrase them as questions for us to consider, and I'll go through them sort of one by one, and then we'll pause, and then we'll just sort of open up the floor to questions, and Stacy will moderate, right? So the first one that I want to...
Stephen, before you go ahead, I do want to ask you one question.
Yes, back.
Do we believe young people have anything to offer? It's implicit that the answer is yes to that question. I want to make that clear. I mean, yeah, the answer could be no if you're coming from a very negative place, but really the answer to that question has to be yes for all of our parishes, for their survival, for, their future.
Yeah.
Am I wrong in saying that?
I think the answer needs to be yes, right? I think the question for us though is the answer actually yes?
Okay.
And I'll frame it in this way. This is kind of a story which is potentially helpful. Jenny Mosher, who's in charge of the Telos project that's happening out of the seminary, she tells this wonderful story, which I think is interesting. She tells this story. She grew up here in the city, in New York City. She graduated high school, and she was working at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in the summer between graduating high school and starting college. And she was in the Asian wing of the museum. She was sort of curating the pieces, putting together descriptions for them, rotating things in and out of the active exhibit, because what you see in the museum is only a tiny piece of the collection the museum actually has. Sure. And there's what she described as the attic. There's this room upstairs which has all this sort of stuff. And she goes up there and she describes it as this sort of Indiana Jones dusty old thing with rickety wooden shelves, and it's cramped and it's tight, and there's just, it's priceless, right? The amount of ceramics and vases and artifacts that are there over the course of the years. And she's going and she's rotating things back into the attic and out of the attic for the public exhibit. She's holding this thing in her hand. She's like, this whatever it was, right, is 1,700 years old. It's priceless. Just holding it in her hand, right? She looks over her shoulder, and there's a shelf, which is again full of these things, just inches behind her. So if she sort of sneezes the wrong way and knocks the shelf over, it's going to be a disaster. And she's surrounded by this priceless stuff, and she's literally holding it in her hand. And she realizes at that point, like, the church has never trusted me to do something this risky. Like, the church has never sort of seen me as part of the team or as adding value to the point that they would ever let me do something like this. I am the sort of person who can walk through the exhibit and sort of watch, but I've never in the church been the sort of person who can actually add to the exhibit. And that was powerful. Yeah. That was powerful. I wonder, right? Are on some level, are children meant to be seen and not heard, even in the church? They shouldn't. The answer to that is no, they shouldn't. But again, I think we have to ask ourselves the question at the very least.
Sorry,
so anyway, does that make sense?
To take you off on a tangent. That makes perfect sense. Absolutely.
No, it's fine. It's a good question. So four elements, which I'm also going to phrase as questions, just to sort of maybe sort of jog the conversation going forward. Element 1 of cultivating this culture of stewardship: are we willing to listen? And I ask that question, and this is sort of related to the question that I said before. I think there's a lot of young people who have an experience in the church that the church isn't really willing to listen to them, right? The church is this thing full of adults who have the answers, and children are there, and they are sort of meant to be quiet, and they are meant to simply absorb what we have, right? I think there's kind of an implicit understanding of ministry sometimes, right? Like, what is ministry? It's kind of filling the heads of kids with orthodox perspectives. It's making sure that they sort of walk away having memorized the right things, learned the right things. They are expected to listen to us. but are we willing at the same time to listen to them? Are we willing to entertain doubts, expressions of doubt? Are we willing to entertain difficult questions? Are we willing to entertain feedback and ideas, right? I think when we can demonstrate to young people that we are willing to listen to them, it establishes them as part of the body. It establishes them as valuable. It establishes them as connected. It establishes them as having a role, as opposed to us not being willing to listen, which facilitates disconnection, which facilitates resentment, right? Which facilitates isolation. And I think it's the experience of a lot of young people. The church has never sort of been the kind of place where older people listen to me. And people of all sorts want to be heard, right? I think it's no accident that young people in particular are constantly blasting things out into social media, right? They're constantly sending pictures and ideas and tweets and whatever it is, right? They're constantly blasting stuff out into social media because they desperately want somebody to listen to them. And in the context of the church, I see this very clearly in the context of confession, right? Confession frequently, the only time young people do this is at camp. And what happens at camp? Confession is offered and young people, like, they're there until 3 or 4 in the morning because the line is so dang long. Young people want to be listened to. And if we can listen to them, we can understand who they are. We can understand the gifts that they bring to the table. We can make them feel like they are part of the body of Christ, which is what they are. But if we're not willing to listen, that facilitates more of that doubt and loneliness and uncertainty that we were talking about before. So are we willing to listen? Are we willing to listen to young people? Second one, are we open to failure? Right? This goes back to the story that I was telling about Jenny up at Telos, right? Are we willing to put young people in a position where they can make mistakes? Are we open to them working with us and potentially screwing up because they've never done things like this before? I'll give you a silly example. I was talking to a young adult at, because I go around and I do these retreats every month, sometimes more than once a month. There was a young person there who was telling me about a time she tried to volunteer for her parish festival. And, she just wanted to help out. She wanted to give back a little bit. So she shows up and she goes over to the where the place where they're setting up. And she says, I would like to help out with, the lukumadas or whatever it is, right? The sweet stand. And some of the folk who were there said, thanks, but no thanks. We've got it covered. And I was like, I'm just happy to help. I'm happy to hear. I'm happy to offer. It's like, no, we've been doing this for 40 years. We know exactly what we're doing. You just kind of mess it up anyway. Like we've got it covered. And it was a very difficult thing for her to experience. Like, she was being vulnerable. She was offering to help. But because she wasn't good enough at something, because there's inherently kind of a risk, right? When you pass the baton off to somebody else, the answer was no. And I think there are a lot of situations where we don't trust young people to do stuff because we're afraid that they're not going to do it as well as we do. If you think about it, right, what do young people have at the end of the day? They don't necessarily have treasure. I don't know a lot of young people who have 401ks and stock portfolios and whatever. Like, to the extent that they're going to give, they're not going to give financially. They're going to give through offering their time. They're going to give through offering their talents. Like, they're going to do stuff. They're going to help with stuff. They're going to lead stuff. And if we're afraid of them doing that, because they're not going to do it, at least initially, as well as we would like, if we're afraid of them sort of doing things differently than the way that we've done in the past, which can also be another way of sort of thinking about failure, right? Things look differently now than they did for the last 40 or 50 or 60 years. That's off-putting to people. And unfortunately, it's a way that we shut down the instincts to give, because you're not good enough. And the trouble is, you're never going to get good enough unless you practice and unless you fail. And unless we can create kind of a safe environment where people can give and their contribution is going to be valued, I don't know that we're going to be able to create a culture of stewardship. So are we open to failure? Are we open to young people maybe not doing things as well as we would like? At least not at first. Question 3, is our community intergenerational? Think about the way that we deal with young people. I think the way that we deal with young people is shaped and influenced by the way we deal with young people in, like, the school setting. We take the first graders and we put them into a room together. We take the second graders and we put them into a room together, right? And we limit their interaction with other people. There's like the one teacher and the room full of first graders, the one teacher, the room full of second graders. that's not really community, right? On a theological level, that's not the body of Christ. But in a practical sort of sense, it's hard for people to create webs that connect each other. Whereas you think of a family, for instance, or you think of a wider community that is intergenerational, if people are embedded in this web with people that are older than them that they can learn from and serve in a particular way, and people who are younger than them that they can learn from and serve in a particular way, that's really the sort of community web that facilitates service, that facilitates stewardship, right? You have to be sort of a piece in the wider whole. And I think because the way that we deal with young people is influenced by the sort of popular public school model, it's hard for people to do that when they're simply surrounded by fellow second graders, right? When they're sort of off in this little Tupperware container rather than a part of the wider community, which is intergenerational, which is complex, which is in flux, where people have parents and grandparents and cousins and camp counselors and other sort of mentors they can learn from, and also people who are younger than them that they can help. And also older people, right, who are going to be generous and going to be courageous and are going to let them help, because young people can sort of serve upwards and serve downwards. But without that intergenerational sort of real thick community, we're just a bunch of second graders in a classroom by ourselves. And that's not the sort of situation that is conducive to stewardship. It's conducive to isolation, right? It's conducive to you were in this box because you have a deficit, and this deficit needs to be filled by the youth group leader, by the teacher, whatever it is. Not you are a part of a community. You have a valuable spot in this community. And sometimes that means receiving, and sometimes that means giving. So I think a question for all of us is our community actually intergenerational, or is it a bunch of little ice cubes with an ice cube tray? And the final question that I want to ask is our experience of the church holistic? It's kind of a silly photo to use, but I couldn't find anything better. I apologize. I asked the question because I think sometimes, implicitly, we divide the world into the sacred and the secular, right? We divide our lives into who I am in church on Sunday morning and who I am the rest of the time. And it's interesting, right? When we look at the lives of young people who are out there, young people who are doing amazing research projects for their science fairs, young people who are starting nonprofits and businesses at like incredibly young ages, right? There's a lot of vibrancy. There's a lot of intellect. There's a lot of creativity that young people are manifesting on a day-to-day basis. But when we sort of divide things into Sunday morning and the rest of life, when we divide things into sort of sacred and secular, a lot of the natural talents that young people have tend to get channeled into not church life. And church life becomes a place that you go to simply be quiet and listen. Church life becomes a place where you go to be farmed off with, the second graders and the third graders or whatever it is. The time for creativity, the time for exploration, the time for contribution is Monday through Saturday, and Sunday becomes a different animal. And I think if we could create like a real lived, vibrant Christian culture that doesn't see Orthodox Christianity as just a thing that you do on Sunday morning, or identity as Orthodox Christians as just this thing that exists in a little bit of a box. Like if we're always Christians, then even if our kids are not being stewards to us in the parish, right? Even if they're going and they're creating nonprofits and they're doing the things they're already doing anyway, then at least we can be mindful of them doing this as Orthodox Christians because they are still serving Christ and they are still in connection and relationship with Christ wherever they might be. I think the goal of stewardship at the end of the day is not simply them giving to the church in kind of the organizational model, right? We don't increase stewardship simply to increase the bottom line of a parish, right? That's not the goal of stewardship. The goal of facilitating stewardship is to like live actually as Christians, and to live as Christians is to give. Right? I mean, I forget which father wrote this, but he's one of the early apostolic fathers, I want to say, but it's escaping me right now. Sometimes Christians will talk about tithing, right? And Christians have to tithe and whatever it is. But there's one father in particular who says like, no, tithing is something that existed before Christ, right? But it's like in the fullness of what we are, like we're supposed to give everything. We're supposed to give of ourselves and each other and our whole lives to Christ our God. We're not simply like reserving a piece. And I think sometimes when we divide the world up, we're reserving these pieces, if at all. But if we can create real stewards, maybe they're going to give to our parish, maybe not. But whatever they're going to do, they're going to serve the world. They're going to be a witness, whether it's in the boardroom, whether it's on the streets with a nonprofit, or whether it's in the hall of a parish. they're going to serve and they're going to give faithfully as Christians, not necessarily for our benefit organizationally, right? But that's not the point, I think, at the end of the day. And we can do that if we really integrate our existence and see the church as not simply this thing that's out there, but our faith in Christ, our relationship with Christ as a thing that we live constantly and a thing that shapes every choice that we make. You know, if our kids are going to go out there and start businesses that are filling a niche in the market and are going to serve people, let them do it as Christians, right? That's why my fourth question is our experience of being Christians holistic? And that's the final thing that I want to offer, and we can open things up to questions. Just as sort of a little bit of a heads up, we have been working for a long time on this ministry course, which gets into a lot of the observations that we've made over the years, a lot of the best practices that we're sort of setting forward. I'm hoping that this is done before the end of the year. God willing. It's been a wacky, weird couple of years, so I'm hoping so anyway. But kind of things like this and questions like this are really going to percolate out in this course when it's ready. And then, of course, there's ways to contact us on social media for other sort of questions and the kind of resources and stuff that we put out. So I figured I would end with that. And now I'm totally open to a conversation and questions.
I'm just curious, Stephen, that last item you showed me, do you have an idea how you'll apply it? Will it be in sort of a B2B style, meaning presentation to large groups of people, or?
No, this will be online lessons, basically.
Oh, okay.
Online modules with workbooks. Yeah, things that people can do at home in their own pace.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah.
Terrific.
When it's ready. I mean, I wanted it to be out ready last August, and it did not happen because things have been wacky for the last couple of years at the Archdiocese, but there you go.
No doubt. No doubt. Okay, so whether it's through the chat or if you want to unmute yourself and ask a question, please feel free to. I think Stephen gave us a lot of good material there. And I know I have questions, but I'm the moderator and I shouldn't take too much of the time. So is there anybody who wants to start with a question?
I have a question. Actually, it's sort of a comment as I was hearing you say, so gee, our church doesn't trust young people to like do things in the church. But I was thinking about other faith groups where like Latter-day Saints, Seventh-day Adventists, they send their young people out on personal evangelism missions for a year or longer out in the public. You know, it seemed to me, well, you should send your retired people out who are very experienced, but you know, you're sending the young people out who have all this energy. But boy, I have to wonder whether our church ever countenance that. I mean, providing enough training to have our young people go out door to door for personal evangelism.
Yeah. Well, and think about what the goal of something like that is really, right? Because I think there's two ways of expressing that goal. One is the evangelical goal of hopefully bringing on new believers. Although, to be totally honest, I don't know how many people have been converted by the sort of door-to-door sales model. Honestly, I think the more compelling goal there is that sort of the formation, right, of identity and the courage that is developed by actually going out there and placing yourself in this. Like, even if a young person spends, 6 months going door to door or whatever it is and doesn't save a single soul, that person is probably going to come back energized and renewed and sort of committed in a way that somebody hasn't. And this, I think, really goes back to to a fundamental question when it comes even to stewardship, right? I think on some level, on a very deep human level, there is a correlation in our minds between things that demand a lot from us and things that have value, right? I don't think, and again, now we're looking at it sort of not theologically, sort of like leaving questions of grace and whatever aside, just sort of psychologically. When the selling point of the church was, come be a Christian, you'll probably die for it. That's when the church was growing leaps and bounds, right? Now that it's like, come to the church, it demands absolutely nothing from you. You can fast or not. You can come to church on Sunday or not. It just doesn't matter. People are more rigorous about their fidelity to their Sunday night HBO show than they are to their Sunday morning church service. And when more is expected of them, like there's just kind of this inherent, it forms you in a sort of way. right? So I think it would be interesting, like if we gave young people some kind of, some sort of responsibility like that, not necessarily what would it do for the wider world, but what would it do to them?
Anybody else want to ask a question on phone? Helen or Michelle?
It's Helen. Hi. It's Helen. Hi. So I'm very interested. I know our parish has done a couple mission trips, and it seemed to generate or foster a sense of community among the team, especially since adults and young people were working well together. Is this becoming a norm in the Archdiocese? Are you seeing that kind of trend anywhere? Can you make any suggestions to us to be able to foster that kind of experience?
The sort of the mission trip experience specifically?
Yeah, well, mission trip experience or some sort of, let's start with that.
Okay.
Let's start with that.
So I mean, I think there are more opportunities today than there were probably a few years ago, but there's also more scarcity, I think, in a situation like this. Like when I think of the leave the city and go do some sort of like mission activity together as a wider community, it tends to be something like Project Mexico, and maybe that's it, right, that I can think of. So there are opportunities, and there are certainly multiple slots and sort of multiple opportunities throughout the course of the year, but there's a scarcity to that. So that can be a piece of something, but there's only so many weeks in the years. There's only so many building teams that Project Mexico can send out, which is great. I mean, it's a wonderful opportunity if the parish ever has a chance to go to that. But there is an opportunity also to be creative. There is an opportunity also to do things not simply kind of away in another country, but just sort of in the wider community, right? There is unfortunately there's need and there is opportunity anywhere we might be. And I think it's wonderful if these can be multi-generational opportunities where, people go out and sort of do soup kitchen runs, or do, like here in New York, there's this program called Midnight Runs, which is, I forget who organizes it, but different communities can participate. Some Orthodox communities participate as well. And there's sort of like a route in the city, and there's stops and parishes who get designated for a particular night route. They load up on food, they load up on clothes, winter clothes when it starts getting colder out, and they just do sort of a distribution. And it's people of all ages who can go and spend some time with people who are in need, right? And it's a wonderful opportunity to witness to the faith. It's a wonderful opportunity to experience the real grace, right, and the strength that people have in these difficult circumstances. One thing that's really wonderful about a lot of these trips is sometimes we're under the illusion that we're going to go there and sort of help other people, right? But it's really a humbling experience when you see more grace in the person you're feeding, right, than in you. So I think there's a lot of grace that happens in situations like this. And there's opportunities for sort of the pre-organized, travel abroad sort of stuff. But there's also, I think, incredible opportunities anywhere we might be, because there's people who are hungry in the streets. There are people who are elderly and can't get anywhere, right? There are people who are sick in the hospital bed. I mean, there's all sorts of people that can be visited and helped and ministered to in some sort of way, even if that just means sitting with people who are lonely and giving a sandwich to those who are hungry. Like that's ministry at the end of the day. And ministry is a thing that we don't simply receive as Christians, right? But it's something we also offer. It's something we also participate in. And opportunities like that can be wonderful opportunities for people of all ages to come together and minister to others and minister to each other when it's kind of a difficult and a shocking thing, when you see somebody who is hungry, when you see somebody who is alone or sick, whatever it might be. Does that make any sense?
Yes, thank you.
Other questions? Well, I'm gonna fill in and ask one. Steve, when you talked about that sort of gap that happens, right, when somebody kind of completes their high school career, maybe they go off to college somewhere and come back to their home parish or establish themselves entirely in a new city. And it's not until, maybe it's time for them to get married, that they find themselves coming back to church for whatever reason. I guess what I'm looking for is how do you see us sort of connecting or filling that gap between post high school and when a young adult is getting married? There was a priest my dad grew up with that said it was the priest's job to hatch them, match them, and dispatch them. And, when you're 25, 30, 35, it's match time, right? And you go, oh my gosh, I haven't been active in my church. Now it's time to be again. But I'm looking for a way to kind of keep some connectivity with young adults post high school and into their 30s.
Yeah. And I think that the question for us becomes, right, what's the goal at the end of the day? If the goal simply to get them in the church building, is the goal to simply get them in a program? Because I think the way that we do a lot of youth ministry, that's kind of the implicit goal, right? Think about the way that we talk about success sometimes. We host a retreat. What's the first question that always gets asked? Like, oh, great, how many people showed up?
Sure.
Not what happened, not what people took away with it, how many people showed up. And I think implicitly that's kind of the goal very frequently. And so young adults are gone at some point, and our goal is to bring them back, right? They need to be here. But it's very rarely that I hear people talk about, our goal isn't simply to get them here for the sake of like rosters building or whatever it is. But it's about introducing them to who Christ is. It's about making sure that our young adults and young people of all ages, right, like have a prayer rule and are talking to God on a regular basis and like know who God is, right? That we're cultivating a sort of sense of safety in this community such that when a person goes through whatever sort of doubts and wanderings, like they come back and just like the father of the prodigal son, we're excited to see them rather than are going to make them feel ashamed that they've gone, right? I think that the question needs to be deeper than simply just getting them here. I think the question needs to be, how do we help these young people actually become Christians? And how do we more accurately, more faithfully witness to the gospel in our community dealings and in our personal dealings such that they were going to come to know Christ through us? Yeah. Because again, like what's the mark of successful youth ministry? Kids, I remember when I was a kid at Sunday school, I got like the attendance award or whatever it is. Like I showed up every day for a year, which is all well and good, right? But I wasn't praying at home or doing anything. Like what was the point of all of that?
Showing up is only part of the issue. The rest is what you do with it, how you incorporate it daily, et cetera, et cetera.
Showing up is hopefully a means to an end. Like obviously, like if hopefully, like we want people to show up because we want them to experience Christ's love. We want them to show up on a Sunday morning because we want them to receive the body and blood of Christ, right? Not we want them to show up because we're afraid that they're somewhere else. Not because we want them to show up because we're afraid that the parish budget is going to go down because we don't have enough stewards. I mean, I've heard these, right? These are kind of the real rationales that we sometimes think of.
Yep. Yep, indeed. Before I keep talking, anybody else on the phone have a question they'd like to pose?
Father Andrew from New York. Approaching from a different angle, because I recently experienced this in my own parish at our last festival. How do we, or is there any suggestion as to how we break through the this attitude that some of our older parishioners have, that kind of territorial attitude, that I think Stephen referred to quite, very plainly and clearly when, the young person who comes forward and says, hey, I'm here at the festival, I'd like to help, and they get turned away because, of whatever XYZ reason, because that, is something that we have been dealing with here in this parish for a little while, and I understand some people want to keep things safe for the young people, especially in the kitchen with hot ovens and deep fryers and things like that going, but at the same time, not wanting to turn our kids away who actually do want to do something to help, because, you know, mom and dad are here working at the festival and Yaya and Papu are here working at the festival. You know, I want to do something too. Mm-hmm. So how do we break through that attitude that, well, you know, these kids, they're too young, and, you know, you know, because I actually said it when the last conversation came up. I said it to some of the people that wanted to put all these weird kind of age restrictions about, you know, who can work at which station depending on how old you are. I said, guys, I said, you know, this is all well and good, but keep something in mind. If you guys think that our kids who are teenagers now are going to magically just show up at the church when they're in their mid-20s to be active members of our community when we turn them away when they're younger, I think we're misleading ourselves if we think that's what's going to happen. Mm. You know, the best way to keep them, you know, here in their, you know, mid-20s, early 20s, whatever, is to, you know, not turn them away or even worse yet, kind of, you know, scold them for wanting to show up and help when they're in their, you know, teens or maybe even younger.
Yeah.
I find I have more resistance trying to get our older people to let the younger people come in and work than the younger people being, you know, not wanting to plug in.
Yeah.
Hey,
yeah.
Stephen, before you jump in and answer, somebody texted me, Helen Rankin, and she'd like to offer a little bit of an answer to Father Andrew's question, if that's okay.
Please, yeah, yeah.
Helen?
Oh, I didn't expect that. I think I've approached it in a couple ways. I've had the pleasure of either chairing festival or being in the office and trying to keep things moving. And I have identified, quote, safe booths for the kids to participate in, where I spend some time with those chairmen of those booths and say, hey, you know, our kids really want to be able to participate this year. How can we include them? And the blessing in all this is some of our older folks, and I've actually had to say, you know, whether it means them just running and picking up items for you like cups and napkins from the pantry, or whether it means them just wiping things down for you, just any little thing. And honestly, at the end of festival weekend, they're very, very excited that the kids were there. Mm. And there are places I don't really want young kids near the French fry machine. That seems not safe for me at this point. But we try and help our yayas and our papuzas understand that if we want our children to be chairing the festival in 10 years, we have to get them feeling like they belong now. So I'm encouraged. And of course, Stacy always chairs the food lines and the kids love to go there.
Because we had fun.
That's wonderful.
Thank you.
Let me sort of like, yeah, just to sort of synthesize this a little bit, because I think that's a wonderful experience, right? My sense is that the way that I would describe, in a more theoretical sense, what you're expressing in a practical sort of sense is you deal with questions like this as ministry. Really, right? I think, you know, we can't push these things as agendas, right? It's not really about just increasing the amount of young people who are there. I think it's ministry. It's on some level ministering to the older people who are there, right? Talking to them face to face, helping them to understand, like, there's young people who love the Lord, there's young people who love their community, and they want to express that love. You know, please don't get in the way of them expressing that love. Like, they're here, right? They're here and they want to love. And it's a blessing to give them an opportunity to love. Ministry in the sense of, like, maybe also asking, like, what are they afraid of, right? What's the resistance? Maybe some of them are going to be afraid of kids getting splattered by the French fries, right? Maybe some of them, like, I've had conversations like this with people in different communities. Maybe sometimes people are afraid that their space in the community is going to be taken by somebody else, right? If you're the guy who's been doing French fries for 40 years, or if you're the woman who's been doing, you know, the baklava for 40 years, like, that's part of that's wrapped in your identity. And to pass it on to somebody else is a loss, right? And that person needs to be ministered to. because to give something is actually to sort of like have their self-understanding change. And maybe they're afraid of that, right? I mean, I think it's similar even when we talk about like the language issue between older folks and younger folks, right? Like it's not simply as simple as we need to do more English, right? So for some people, like this is the way that I've always experienced the church, and I'm afraid of the church sounding different, right? Because that's kind of a loss. So I think it's really ministry at the end of the day. It's not even thinking about these questions as agendas, but putting people together, right? And saying like, how can this older generation love this younger generation? How can this younger generation love this older generation? And if that means for the younger generation, like you're going to serve, but you're really little and we're afraid of that hot oil. I love you, and I love you too much to let you serve in the way that you might want, but I want you to be here. I don't want you gone. I want you to be here. Maybe it's not what you wanted, maybe not yet, but I love you too much to put you at risk. Yeah. And if it's an older person, right? I love you and you're here and you're valuable, and nothing is going to ever stop me from loving you, even if you're not doing French fries anymore, even if you're not frying the lucumades anymore. Yeah. If anything else, you have become sort of a mentor to this person, right? Your ministry now is not simply making the lucumades, but your ministry is guiding this person and showing love to this person who's unsure and doesn't know what he or she is doing, right? I mean, I think it's really ministry at the end of the day.
And I think it goes back to, how you define failure, right? If I'm not the lucumades maker, if I'm not the French fry maker anymore, there's an element that you failed somehow, or there's a fear that you're failing somehow.
Totally.
Helen wanted to add one more thing. Go ahead, Helen.
Yeah.
I also believe that it's really important in terms of the youth in our parishes that when we see them doing something amazing, whether it be dancing, opening the door for somebody, smiling with one of our guests coming in, whatever it could be, that we make sure that we catch them and tell them how they are great witnesses of Christ. Because I think that helps them understand that they are part of the body of Christ, that they are too part of our witness to the community. And honestly, we have some exceptional young people that know what to do and smile the right way and are very, very courteous. And I think once we've started, they continue that attitude for the rest of the weekend.
Father Joe, I know, wanted to get in here and ask a question. Are you still there, Father Joe?
Yep, still here. I don't have a lot of young adults. I have a few in the area, and it seems like they don't come to church much, and they've sort of insulated themselves from church because they really bought into world messages of gender issues and all kinds of other stuff, recreational drug use and this, that, and the other thing. So I can't get to them, but it seems that they will come to the church to help with the lucumades or make gyros or something. And so I can get them there, but I can't seem to get past that to actually talk to them. And I know that's going to be crucial. They need to have that connection with Jesus Christ. I was wondering if Stephen had any, icebreakers, or how do you break through that? You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a good question. I think like there's a couple of things, right? Sometimes people are coming in, people approach us, right, individually as sort of ministers of the church, right? Or the church sort of more broadly, shaped by some of the experience that they had elsewhere. So maybe they're drawn to something that they're finding elsewhere. Maybe they're repelled by something that they experienced elsewhere. It sounds like, right, one possibility would be you have young people who are already demonstrating some level of community spirit, some desire to serve and sort of put love into practice. Even if they're not doing it for the Lord's sake explicitly, they kind of are, or at least there's a seed of that. Is there a way that spirit can be harnessed for other purposes? Somebody who has this spirit and says, you know what, it would be great if our community had more of a philanthropic presence in the wider neighborhood or whatever it is. Do you think it would be possible to look into collecting a group from here once a month and getting them to a soup kitchen, or doing kind of like a drive or something, and seeing maybe if it's possible to just sort of expand and give a little bit more, invite some of these people who are showing up to give, invite them to give a little bit more, and invite them to give a little bit more, not during festival weekend, but as part of some other kind of like ministry presence of the church. If they can see that you trust them, that the community has this desire to love the wider community, maybe that can be a way to sort of slowly begin to minister to Christ for them.
Go ahead, Father
That's
Joe.
a great idea. And there are opportunities in town to do that with those kids. And I am blessed. I have like a 25-year-old on my parish council who's a really good guy, so he might be able to help me in that. So thank you.
Yeah. Thank God.
I'm just mindful of everybody's time. We've got about 5 minutes until we hit our hour mark. I'm not rushing anybody, but I just want to know if there are any additional questions. I'm kind of monitoring text and chat and email.
Thank you, Stacy.
Let's see. It is hard to hear in all ministries. This is how I did tough skin. Oh, okay. More of a comment than a question. Anybody else? Ted, you haven't been able to get in and ask a question. Is there something you wanted to ask us, Stephen? I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I'm putting you on the spot.
Oh, muted, I think, Ted.
Yeah, he's muted.
Oh.
Can I unmute him?
I think as admin. Okay, he's going to type it.
Yeah, okay.
And just to let everybody know, Stacy, you have my email. If anybody wants to, ask a question later on, please feel free to reach out to Stacy. You can pass your emails on to me. This doesn't have to be the end of it.
Yeah. And I will send my distribution list, Steve, is about 40 people. And I've probably heard from 6 to 10 who, like I said, are anxious to watch the video after the fact, but couldn't join us.
Yeah.
Let's see. So I will make sure you're copied on that email.
And Ted actually has a good question there. Does anyone have a success story to share? I find those helpful. I think that's good. Those are helpful. I don't know. I mean, for the sake of ending this on sort of a really hopeful kind of positive note, does anybody want to jump in and maybe offer kind of a success story from everybody's experience of stewardship, kind of young people's offerings?
Well, I'm sorry it's going to be me to jump in here. Steve, just so you know, both Helen and I are in Columbus, Ohio. Mm-hmm. And in April of this year, we held an event in our parish called Rise Against Hunger. It's an organization, their goal is basically to eliminate hunger by 2030 around the world. And one night after, it was during Lent, it was April 3rd. So it was after why is my mind going blank on what Wednesday night service is held during Lent?
Pre-sanctified.
Pre-sanctified, okay, thank you. We had 100 people stick around and package meals. And this was, when you talk about intergenerational, this was an intergenerational event. It drew, like I said, 100 volunteers who in the span of about 90 minutes packaged 13,000 meals that are being shipped around the world to places where hunger is most acute. Now, there is certainly no shortage of need in the United States, but it was a great event for our parish. It was a rallying event due in no small part to Helen's hard work of recruiting volunteers, but just how it brought together young and old. It brought together, people who you might consider outliers, not regular church attendees. And so I'm telling this story because the point you just made to Father Joe about a community event, an opportunity to serve will often draw people that you might not expect. And it was a tremendous success in our parish, so much so that we're trying to keep it as a parish-wide event instead of Goya doing it and different groups doing it individually. We want to maintain it as a entire parish event. But it was a great example of, you know, people acting as the hands and feet of Christ, really. Yeah. So I share that because it was really quite a moving, you know, touching event. I would say for 2019, it will be the non-liturgical event in our community that most people will remember. It really had that much of an impact. Rise Against Hunger.
Wonderful.
Look it up if you're interested in your parish.
Wonderful. We're at 5:29. Can I give two? I'll give two real quick ones since we're wrapping up. Two very divergent ones, very different. So one of them is I heard secondhand from a friend of mine who was recently visiting the church in Poland. Actually, he was traveling around in Eastern Europe. He spent some time in Poland, and he got to go to like some of the metropolises or whatever it is. And I think through like a family connection, he knew, you know, one of the bishops out there. And he's a young guy himself, and he was, you know, observing that there's all this sort of like vibrant stuff that's happening for young people. And he asked the bishop, and he said, you know, like, what are you guys doing for young people? Like, it's really interesting. There seems to be in this, you know, former communist country, right? Like a lot of young people who are faithful. And the bishop sort of shrugged his shoulders and said, I don't know. And he said, what do you mean? And he said, well, we just let the young people sort of do the things for young people. I don't get in. I don't sort of micromanage. I let them run with it, and they're doing a fantastic job. Wow. And he didn't, in other words, like it wasn't sort of neglect. It was sort of trust, right? I don't have to worry about it. I know the people who are in charge, they're faithful young adults. I know they're going to do an amazing job. And that was it. So I thought that was really powerful. You don't see a lot of that distance, I think, in church life. And then there's a second one here, much closer to home. During one of my travels, there was a young woman that I met who was tapped by her parish priest, actually, because, you know, she was faithful. He would always kind of see her at services, like came from a good family. And he said, like, you know, do you think you can sort of build a group of young adults and some fellowship? And she began reaching out, and she sort of like began, you know, bringing people together for services, for, you know, she would invite them out to her house, her family house. And like, there's this interesting community of people that has developed. And again, it's kind of, you know, the clergy are involved, and they come and they'll sort of, you know, they'll pray with the young adults and answer questions and just spend time with them. But really the prime mover of it was a young adult who was looked in the eye and said, like, can you build this? And she said, yeah. And she tapped others to help her, and it's not sort of only falling upon her. And I think it's a really wonderful example of holistic community. You know, she opens up her home to people. She organizes things. She sort of lets other people organize things. And it's kind of this really vibrant community that has developed. And again, it was really this trust, like, you're a young adult and you're faithful. You know, I see you here at Pre-Sanctified during Lent. How do we sort of reach out to others? And through this trust and creativity, like, wonderful things have been happening over the course of the last couple of years.
Terrific. Sorry, I'm having some technical issues on my end. Can you still hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So we are at 5:30 and change. If there aren't any other questions, as I said, I'm going to send everybody Stephen's PowerPoint, and with it his email address, so that you're all able to contact him. Father Andrew, are you still on the call?
Yes.
Would you mind closing us in prayer, please?
Not at all. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, amen. Christ our God, we ask for your blessings on our gathering that has just concluded. Help us to grow closer to you, and to help bring not just our young people, but all of our people into a deeper relationship with you, and share with one another our successes and our challenges, so that we can all learn from them and grow. We are holy now and forever, into the ages of ages. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, everybody. Stephen, thank you again and again for your time today. And to everybody that joined us on the phone and on the video conference, thank you. I hope everybody has a wonderful afternoon and evening.
Thank you. God bless everybody.
Yep.
You, Stephen.
Thanks, you too. God bless.
Bye.
Bye.